a forgotten chest buried beneath the floorboards of an abandoned barn, containing secrets that would rewrite a chapter of American history. A collection of wartime letters that challenged everything historians thought they knew about the Civil War's most controversial general. One ordinary woman's chance discovery during a property cleanup that would bring museum directors, historians, and federal agents racing to a remote countryside within hours. This is the remarkable true story of how Eleanor Mitchell's routine barn clearing unearthed classified Civil War documents that had remained hidden for over 150 years, threatening powerful historical narratives and the reputations of families who had shaped the official account for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The antique grandfather clock in Eleanor Mitchell's modest farmhouse kitchen chimed 5:15 a.m., though she had already been awake since before dawn, methodically planning her day over a steaming cup of herbal tea. At 52, the former librarian's hands showed the evidence of 2 years of rural living, having traded her comfortable suburban existence for this remote property following her difficult divorce. The kitchen table was covered with renovation plans, contractor estimates, and property tax assessments, each highlighting the enormous challenge she had taken on with the purchase of the abandoned Whispering Pines property in Millfield County. Eleanor took another sip of tea as she studied the latest structural assessment of the property's outbuildings. The report gave her 30 days to either demolish or properly reinforce the sagging barn that dominated the eastern edge of her 5 acres. Its deteriorating condition deemed a safety hazard by county officials. Richard had been gone from her life for 3 years now, their 25-year marriage ending when she discovered his relationship with a younger colleague at the university where they had both worked. She had used most of her divorce settlement to purchase this property, drawn by its isolation and history, despite warnings from her grown children about taking on such a massive restoration project at her age. "Just 1 month," Eleanor whispered to herself, glancing at the faded photograph of the property from the 1890s that she'd found in the county historical archives. The image showed the barn in its prime, an impressive structure built with craftsmanship rarely seen in modern construction. Now it stood as a weathered skeleton, its roof partially collapsed and its timbers gradually surrendering to gravity and neglect. The county assessment recommended complete demolition, but Eleanor had fought for the option to reinforce and preserve the structure, unwilling to erase this piece of local history despite the higher cost. Outside, the early April mist hung over the meadow that separated the farmhouse from the barn. The morning light cast the dilapidated structure in a golden glow that belied its precarious condition. Eleanor had purchased the property primarily for the historic farmhouse, a well-built Victorian that needed significant updating but maintained good bones. The barn had been an afterthought, something she vaguely planned to address eventually. The county's safety notice had forced that eventuality into immediate focus. Eleanor finished her tea and moved to the window, watching as the sun gradually burned away the morning fog. Despite the challenges, she felt a deep connection to this place, its quiet solitude, its tangible history, the way it demanded her full attention rather than allowing her to dwell on the collapse of her marriage and academic career. The property had become both her burden and her healing. "Better get started," she murmured, pulling on worn work boots and a heavy canvas jacket against the spring chill. The barn cleanup would take days, and the structural reinforcement would strain her remaining savings. But the alternative, watching a piece of 19th century craftsmanship reduced to a pile of splintered timber and rusted nails, was unthinkable. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as Eleanor crossed the dew-soaked field. A family of rabbits scattered at her approach, disappearing into the tall grass that bordered the property. the red-winged blackbirds that nested in the meadow called their distinctive song as she passed beneath their territory. These daily encounters with wildlife had become a treasured part of her new rural existence, so different from the manicured lawns and concrete sidewalks of her academic life. The barn door hung precariously from a single rusted hinge, requiring careful maneuvering to create an opening wide enough to enter. Eleanor had avoided venturing too far into the structure since purchasing the property, concerned about the stability of the interior flooring. The county inspector had confirmed her caution was warranted, identifying several areas where the floorboards had rotted completely through, creating dangerous pits into the root cellar below. As Eleanor entered, the smell of aged wood, decades of accumulated dust, and hints of creatures that had made their homes in the abandoned structure filled her nostrils. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof and wallboards, creating dramatic shafts of light that illuminated dancing dust motes. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with the main floor stretching nearly 60 feet in length, and remnants of stalls and storage areas still visible despite years of neglect. According to the property history Eleanor had researched, the barn had been built in 1868 by Jonathan Millfield, one of the county's founding families, who had established a prosperous horse breeding operation after the Civil War. The Millfield estate had eventually been divided and sold off during the Great Depression, with the section containing the farmhouse and barn passing through several owners before sitting vacant for nearly a decade prior to Eleanor's purchase. Eleanor began her work methodically, starting near the entrance and gradually working her way deeper into the structure. Her plan was to clear the debris, salvage any items of potential historical value for the county museum, and identify the most critical structural issues before the reinforcement team arrived the following week. She created careful piles, rotted lumber destined for disposal, antique hardware that might be repurposed, and unidentifiable objects requiring closer examination. By mid-morning, Eleanor had cleared a path to what appeared to have been the farm office, a small room partitioned from the main space with rough-hewn walls. The desk that dominated the room had partially collapsed, its drawers spilling forgotten, papers and ledgers onto the worn floorboards. Eleanor knelt carefully, mindful of the inspector's warnings about structural weakness, and began sorting through the scattered documents. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most were mundane farm records, feed purchases, horse breeding lineages, equipment repairs, dating from the early 1900s. The Millfield family had apparently left these records behind when they sold the property, perhaps considering them too insignificant to transport. Eleanor, with her librarian's appreciation for historical documentation, carefully placed these in a box for potential donation to the County Historical Society. As she shifted a particularly heavy ledger, Eleanor noticed something unusual about the floorboards beneath. Unlike the weathered grey planks that formed most of the barn flooring, this section appeared newer, with boards of slightly different dimensions. More curiously, the nails securing these boards showed less corrosion than those in surrounding areas. Drawing on the restoration knowledge she'd acquired since purchasing the property, Eleanor recognized the telltale signs of a repair or replacement that didn't match the original construction, something done perhaps 50 or 75 years after the barn was built. Her curiosity piqued. She examined the section more carefully, noting that the replaced floorboards formed a nearly perfect rectangle, approximately 4 feet by 3 feet. Using a pry bar she'd brought for removing damaged boards, Eleanor gently tested the edges of one plank. To her surprise, it lifted with relative ease, suggesting the nails had been intentionally left loose or had been designed for periodic removal. Her heart quickened as she carefully pried up the board, then another, revealing a dark cavity beneath the floor. Eleanor retrieved the flashlight from her tool belt and directed its beam into the opening. Rather than the expected view of bare earth or random debris, the light revealed something entirely unexpected. A wooden chest, its surface covered with a thick layer of dust, but otherwise remarkably well preserved in its hidden location. With growing excitement, Eleanor removed several more floorboards until she had created an opening large enough to access the chest. She descended carefully into the shallow space, finding solid ground beneath her feet rather than the loose dirt she had expected. The space appeared to be a purpose-built hiding spot rather than simply the area beneath the floor, with brick-lined walls forming a small chamber. The chest itself was constructed of solid oak with iron fittings, approximately 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. No lock secured it, but decades of disuse had caused the wood to swell, sealing the lid tightly to the base. Eleanor considered trying to remove the entire chest from its hiding place, but quickly abandoned the idea given its weight and the awkward access. Instead, she carefully applied pressure to the lid, gradually working it loose from its base. With a sound like a sigh, the chest finally opened, releasing the scent of old paper and leather preserved in the dark, dry space for over a century. Eleanor directed her flashlight into the interior, revealing a carefully organized collection of documents, leather-bound journals, and several small cloth-wrapped packages. The items appeared to have been deliberately arranged, rather than hastily hidden, suggesting whoever concealed them had intended for their eventual discovery. The uppermost item was an envelope yellowed with age, but still intact, sealed with red wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. With careful hands, honed by years of handling fragile library materials, Eleanor lifted the envelope and gently broke the seal. Inside was a single page of handwritten text, the elegant script immediately identifiable as 19th century penmanship. To whoever discovers this collection, these documents contain truths about General Thomas Shadwell and his actions during the Battle of Whispering Creek that contradict the official military records. As his former adjutant, I could not in good conscience destroy these materials as ordered, nor could I risk revealing them during my lifetime. I entrust them to the future, when perhaps the full history of our conflict can be acknowledged without threat to the Shadwell family's powerful position. With the hope of eventual historical truth, Major William Millfield, former 14th Virginia Infantry, April 9, 1885. Eleanor's breath caught as she processed the implications. General Thomas Shadwell was a significant Civil War figure, celebrated as a Confederate tactical genius whose victory at Whispering Creek had prolonged the war by preventing Union forces from controlling key supply routes. His military decisions had been studied for generations, and his descendants had become one of the most politically influential families in Virginia, with a current Shadwell serving as a senior state senator. With growing excitement, Eleanor carefully examined the chest's other contents. The journals appeared to be Major Millfield's personal war diaries, containing detailed accounts of campaigns and private reflections on leadership decisions. The cloth-wrapped packages contained military orders, correspondence between Shadwell and other Confederate leaders, and most significantly, what appeared to be Shadwell's personal correspondence with Millfield. These letters revealed a stunning narrative entirely absent from historical records. According to Millfield's detailed accounts, Shadwell's celebrated victory at Whispering Creek had not resulted from military genius, but from advance information about Union movements obtained by intercepting civilian medical supply wagons and torturing their drivers. More damning still, Shadwell had apparently ordered the execution of Union prisoners against the explicit protests of his officers, including Millfield. The final journal contained Millfield's post-war account of how Shadwell had systematically eliminated evidence of these actions, threatening officers who might speak out and using his growing political influence to establish the heroic narrative that would define his legacy. Millfield himself had been pressured into silence through threats against his family, ultimately relocating to this remote property to escape Shadwell's continued surveillance. Eleanor sat back on her heels, the implications of her discovery washing over her. This wasn't merely an interesting historical footnote, it was evidence that would fundamentally challenge the established narrative about a military leader whose strategic decisions were still taught at war colleges and whose family continued to wield significant political power based partly on their illustrious ancestors' reputation. With shaking hands, Eleanor carefully photographed each document with her smartphone, creating a digital backup before returning the materials to the chest. Some instinct told her this precaution might prove necessary in the coming days. The rural property had limited cell service, so she couldn't immediately share her findings, but the documentation was now securely backed up to her cloud storage. Eleanor carefully replaced the chest's contents and closed the lid, her mind racing with questions. Should she contact the County Historical Society immediately, reach out to university historians who specialized in Civil War history? Inform the Shadwell family directly about information that would undoubtedly damage their ancestors' reputation. The ethical and historical implications seemed equally weighty. Deciding that expert assessment should precede any public disclosure, Eleanor resolved to contact Dr. Margaret Harrington, the director of the State Historical Museum and a nationally recognized Civil War scholar. They had met several times at library conferences before Eleanor's career change, and Harrington had always impressed her with both scholarly rigor and ethical integrity. Eleanor carefully replaced the floorboards, concealing the chest once more, and made her way back to the farmhouse. The discovery had consumed most of the day, with afternoon shadows now stretching across the property. Inside, she composed a carefully worded email to Dr. Harrington, describing the discovery in general terms and attaching several of the less sensational photographs as evidence of authenticity. She mentioned the Shadwell connection only obliquely, aware that even encrypted email wasn't entirely secure. After sending the message, Eleanor tried to resume her normal evening routine, but found concentration impossible. The weight of historical responsibility felt suddenly overwhelming. The documents she had discovered could alter understanding of a pivotal Civil War battle and expose the carefully constructed mythology surrounding one of the Confederacy's most celebrated generals. The potential ramifications extended beyond academic revision to contemporary political implications for the Shadwell family. Eleanor had expected to wait days for a response from the busy museum director, but her phone rang barely 2 hours after sending the email. Dr. Harrington's voice carried unmistakable excitement beneath her professional composure. "Eleanor, I've reviewed the materials you sent. If these documents are authentic, and the handwriting, paper type, and contextual details certainly suggest they may be, you've made an extraordinary discovery. The Millfield-Shadwell connection has never been documented in this way. I need to see these materials as soon as possible." They arranged for Dr. Harrington to visit the following morning, with the museum director emphasizing the importance of discretion until preliminary authentication could be completed. "Historical discoveries of this sensitivity require careful handling," she cautioned. "Let's establish authenticity before considering broader disclosure." Eleanor agreed, relieved to share the responsibility for the documents with a qualified expert. She spent a restless night, her dreams filled with Civil War soldiers and hidden documents, waking frequently to check that her doors were securely locked. A precaution that seemed suddenly more necessary than it had during her previous months. Of rural solitude, the morning brought clear skies and a renewed sense of purpose. Eleanor prepared the farmhouse for Dr. Harrington's visit, clearing her dining table to provide a suitable space for document examination. She had just put on coffee when she heard vehicles approaching, multiple vehicles, by the sound of the engines. Looking out the window, Eleanor was startled to see not just one car, but three. The lead vehicle was an unmarked black SUV, followed by Dr. Harrington's recognizable sedan, and behind them, another black SUV with government plates. As they parked in the gravel area before her house, Eleanor watched with growing alarm as two men in suits emerged from the first vehicle, scanning the property with practiced efficiency before approaching her porch. The sharp knock that followed carried an undeniable authority. With a sense of unreality, Eleanor opened the door to find a tall woman in a tailored suit, flanked by the two men who had surveyed the property. "Ms. Eleanor Mitchell?" the woman asked, her tone professionally neutral. "Yes," Eleanor answered, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm Special Agent Victoria Reynolds, with the FBI's Historical Artifacts Division. These are Agents Donovan and Chen. We understand you've discovered documents relating to General Thomas Shadwell of the Confederate Army. We need to speak with you immediately." Eleanor's mind raced. She had only contacted Dr. Harrington about the discovery and had been deliberately vague about details in her email. How could the FBI possibly know about the chest's contents already? And not just any FBI representatives, but a specialized division appearing at her remote property within hours. "May I see some identification?" she asked, stalling for time. The agents produced credentials confirming their identities, including Agent Reynolds' position as Deputy Director of the Specialized Division. Eleanor hadn't even known existed. "Ms. Mitchell, this is a matter of historical security," Reynolds stated. "We have reason to believe you've discovered documents that may have significant implications for national historical narratives. May we come in?" Eleanor glanced past them to see Dr. Harrington approaching from her car, her expression conveying both excitement and concern. Behind her, two more individuals emerged from the third vehicle, a man and woman in conservative business attire, carrying document cases. "Of course," Eleanor replied, stepping back from the doorway, "though I'm not entirely sure how you learned about my discovery so quickly." As the group entered her modest farmhouse, Eleanor felt a surreal disconnect between her simple rural existence and the sudden convergence of federal agents and historical experts in her living room. After years of quiet academic work, followed by solitary restoration efforts, she had somehow stumbled into what felt like a historical thriller. What she couldn't possibly know in that moment was that the chest she'd discovered beneath the barn, floorboards, would not only change her life, but would force a reckoning with a historical narrative that powerful families and institutions had carefully maintained for over 150 years. Agent Reynolds declined Eleanor's offer of coffee, her focus entirely on the hidden chest. "We'd like to see these documents immediately, Ms. Mitchell," she stated, her tone making it clear this was more directive than request. "I'm sorry, but how exactly did you know about them?" Eleanor asked, her librarian's instinct for information privacy suddenly alert. "I only emailed Dr. Harrington yesterday evening, and I was deliberately vague about the specifics." Dr. Harrington stepped forward, her academic authority evident despite the federal presence. "Eleanor, I apologize for the unexpected entourage. After receiving your email, I consulted with our museum's authentication expert who has security clearance for sensitive historical materials. Standard protocol apparently triggered an automated notification to the Historical Artifacts Division." Reynolds nodded confirmation. "Certain historical keywords and combinations, particularly relating to Civil War military leadership and undocumented accounts, are flagged in our systems. The Shadwell name combined with references to undisclosed wartime activities created an immediate priority alert." Eleanor's gaze moved to the two individuals who had arrived in the third vehicle. They had remained silent, observing the interaction with evident interest. "And them?" she asked, gesturing toward the newcomers. Dr. James Whitmore and Dr. Elise Chen from the National Historical Preservation Foundation, Reynolds explained. They serve as independent observers when potentially sensitive historical materials are discovered. Their role is to ensure proper historical preservation protocols are followed regardless of content. Eleanor nodded slowly, processing the rapid transformation of her private discovery into what was apparently a matter of federal interest. The formal procedures suggested this wasn't the first time undocumented historical materials had triggered such a response. The documents are still in the barn where I found them, she explained. I didn't want to risk damaging them by moving them unnecessarily. As the group followed Eleanor across the dew-damp field toward the barn, she noticed Agent Donovan speaking quietly into his communication device, while Agent Chen maintained a watchful perimeter scan that seemed excessive for a rural property, with the nearest neighbor over a mile away. The barn's deteriorated condition drew concerned glances from the visitors. The county has deemed it structurally unsound, Eleanor explained as they carefully navigated the entrance. I have 30 days to reinforce it or face mandatory demolition. I was assessing the salvage possibilities when I found the hidden compartment. She led them to the former office area, noting how Agent Reynolds documented their path with unobtrusive photographs, while Dr. Harrington observed the barn's historical features with evident appreciation. The two Foundation representatives maintained a professional distance, occasionally making notes but offering no commentary. It's underneath these boards, Eleanor explained, indicating the section she had carefully replaced the previous day. The compartment appears purpose-built, not just the space beneath the floor. Agent Reynolds nodded to her colleagues, who produced specialized tools from their equipment cases. We'll handle the extraction, Ms. Mitchell. These documents may require special handling protocols. Over the next hour, Eleanor watched as the agents methodically documented the hidden compartment and chest, with photographs, measurements, and environmental readings before carefully removing the floorboards. Dr. Harrington joined the examination once the chest was revealed, her expertise in 19th century artifacts providing context for the specialized team. The construction suggests 1870s craftsmanship, Harrington noted, examining the chest without touching it. The iron fittings are hand-forged, consistent with post-war resource limitations. The hiding space itself shows considerable forethought. The brick lining would have protected against moisture and pest damage. The carefully choreographed process of examining and documenting the chest's location made it clear to Eleanor that the FBI team had specific protocols for historical discoveries. Their efficiency suggested this wasn't an unusual assignment for the specialized division, raising questions about how many other historical narratives had been quietly reassessed based on similar discoveries. As the agents prepared to open the chest, Dr. Whitmore from the Foundation finally spoke. For the record, we request that independent documentation proceed concurrently with federal examination. His tone was collegial but firm. The Foundation's mandate requires verification that historically significant materials are properly preserved, regardless of content or security implications. Agent Reynolds acknowledged this with professional courtesy. Noted and approved, Doctor. Standard dual documentation protocols will be followed. The chest opened more easily than during Eleanor's initial discovery, perhaps because her previous examination had broken the decades-old seal of disuse. The contents remained exactly as she had left them, the journals, correspondence, and military orders carefully arranged, with Major Millfield's explanatory letter resting on top. Dr. Harrington drew in a sharp breath as she scanned the letters. Contents. This is extraordinary, she murmured, her academic reserve momentarily overcome. If authentic, these documents would significantly revise our understanding of Shadwell's military career and the Battle of Whispering Creek. Agent Reynolds was already photographing each item as it was carefully removed from the chest, while Dr. Chen documented the process independently. The methodical analysis continued for over an hour, with each document examined, photographed from multiple angles, and placed in specialized preservation sleeves. The contents revealed a narrative far more damning than Eleanor had initially realized. Beyond the prisoner executions and torture allegations, Major Millfield's journals detailed how Shadwell had deliberately sacrificed a company of his own men to create a diversion that would increase the apparent brilliance of his main strategic thrust. Most disturbing were letters suggesting Shadwell had maintained secret communications with certain Union officers, arranging tactical failures that would enhance his reputation while prolonging the conflict, and the profitable arms contracts benefiting his family's manufacturing interests. These allegations would completely transform the historical understanding of Shadwell's military career, Dr. Harrington noted, the implications clearly registering as she reviewed the materials. His tactical genius has been taught at military academies for generations. Multiple historical sites commemorate his heroic leadership. Eleanor watched as Agent Reynolds' expression remained carefully neutral despite the increasingly shocking revelations. The agent's focus remained on proper documentation rather than the content's historical implications, suggesting professional compartmentalization that Eleanor found both impressive and somewhat disturbing. As the examination continued, Eleanor became aware of another vehicle approaching her property. Through the barn's gaps, she glimpsed a luxury sedan with tinted windows pulling alongside the government vehicles. Agent Donovan immediately moved toward the barn entrance, hand shifting subtly toward his concealed weapon. "Ms. Mitchell," Agent Reynolds said quietly, "were you expecting additional visitors today?" "No," Eleanor replied, suddenly alert to the tension that had entered the agent's postures. "I haven't told anyone else about the discovery." Reynolds nodded to Agent Chen, who moved to a position providing clearer sightlines to the approaching visitor, while maintaining proximity to the historical materials. The choreography of their movements revealed training that seemed excessive, for what Eleanor had assumed was primarily an academic division. Through the barn doorway, Eleanor watched as a distinguished-looking man in his 60s emerged from the sedan, his tailored suit and confident bearing suggesting considerable authority. He paused to survey the property before approaching Agent Donovan, presenting what appeared to be credentials that prompted a brief radio exchange before he was allowed to proceed toward the barn. "Senator Charles Shadwell," Agent Reynolds murmured, recognition evident in her tone, "the current head of the Shadwell family and senior member of the State Historical Preservation Committee." Eleanor felt a chill despite the spring warmth. The Shadwell family's representative had somehow learned about the discovery within 24 hours, appearing personally rather than sending aides or legal representatives. The implications were troubling. Either the federal notification systems had informed him automatically due to his committee position, or the family maintained monitoring of anything relating to their historical namesake. Senator Shadwell entered the barn with the confident ease of someone accustomed to accessing any space he desired. His gaze passed over the federal agents and Foundation representatives before settling on Eleanor. "Ms. Mitchell, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the polished cadence of generations of political speech. "I'm Senator Charles Shadwell. I understand you've made an interesting historical discovery on your property." Before Eleanor could respond, Agent Reynolds stepped forward. "Senator, this is an active federal authentication site. We haven't completed preliminary documentation protocols." Shadwell smiled with practiced charm. "Agent Reynolds, good to see you again. The Historical Preservation Committee has oversight authority for Civil War documentation, particularly materials relating to Virginia regiments. I'm simply fulfilling my official responsibilities. The tension between federal authority and political influence hung palpably in the air. Eleanor glanced at Dr. Harrington, whose slight head shake suggested caution. The Foundation representatives maintained careful neutrality, though Dr. Whitmore had positioned himself between the senator and the document processing area. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion at the house," Eleanor suggested, recognizing the deteriorating barn wasn't an appropriate setting for what was evolving into a complex jurisdictional negotiation. "The structural concerns make extended occupation of this building inadvisable." The group relocated to Eleanor's farmhouse, the historical materials carefully transported in specialized containers by agents Chen and Donovan. The modest dining room that had hosted only Eleanor's solitary meals for months now became an impromptu conference site for federal agents, museum directors, Foundation representatives, and a powerful state senator. As the others arranged the materials for continued examination, Senator Shadwell approached Eleanor in the kitchen where she was preparing coffee for her unexpected guests. "Ms. Mitchell, I hope you'll forgive my direct approach," he said, his tone lowered for privacy. "The Shadwell family has maintained historical archives relating to my ancestor for generations. Any new discovery naturally holds significant interest for us, both personally and historically." Eleanor measured her response carefully. "I understand, Senator. However, I'm not a historian. Dr. Harrington and the authentication team should determine the appropriate protocols for these materials." Shadwell's practiced smile remained, though something sharper entered his gaze. "Of course, but as the property owner, you retain certain rights regarding materials discovered on your land. The federal teams can be rather institutional in their approach to historical artifacts. The Shadwell Foundation could offer more personalized handling, along with appropriate compensation for your cooperation." The implication was unmistakable: financial incentives for allowing the Shadwell family to control the narrative revealed by Major Millfield's documents. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Dr. Harrington joined them, her academic authority providing a welcome buffer. "Senator Shadwell, preliminary examination suggests these documents have significant historical importance beyond their connection to your family," she stated. "Standard authentication protocols require independent verification before any decisions about disposition can be made." The senator's expression remained pleasant, though Eleanor noted how his posture subtly straightened, a politician preparing for opposition. "The Shadwell Historical Foundation has state-certified authentication capabilities, Dr. Harrington. We could expedite the process while ensuring appropriate context for potentially sensitive historical materials." "Context," Harrington repeated, the single word carrying evident skepticism. "Historical transparency requires evaluation without predetermined contextual constraints, Senator." Their verbal sparring continued as they rejoined the others in the dining room, where Agent Reynolds had established clear federal authority over the authentication process. The documents were being systematically examined, photographed, and catalogued, with Foundation representatives ensuring independent documentation proceeded alongside government protocols. Eleanor watched this institutional negotiation with growing discomfort. The documents she had discovered were being processed with impressive efficiency, but something fundamental seemed at risk of being lost: the human story behind Major Millfield's decision to preserve these records despite personal risk, and the ethical questions raised by General Shadwell's actions that went beyond mere historical revision. When Agent Reynolds announced the materials would be transported to federal facilities for comprehensive authentication and preservation, Senator Shadwell's objection was immediate and forceful. These documents relate directly to Virginia military history and my family's heritage, he stated. State historical regulations grant jurisdiction to the Virginia Historical Commission for Civil War materials discovered within state boundaries. With respect, Senator, Reynolds countered, materials alleging criminal actions by military officers fall under federal historical protocols regardless of state boundaries. The Historical Artifacts Division has established procedures for sensitive authentication. The jurisdictional dispute escalated, with Reynolds citing federal regulations and Shadwell referencing state historical preservation statutes. The Foundation representatives attempted to mediate, while Dr. Harrington focused on the academic implications rather than governance questions. In the midst of this institutional conflict, Eleanor felt increasingly marginalized in her own home. The discovery that had seemed so personally significant, a connection to the hidden history of her property, was rapidly transforming into ammunition for jurisdictional battles between competing authorities. The debate was interrupted by the arrival of yet another vehicle, this one a modest hybrid bearing university insignia. Through her kitchen window, Eleanor watched as a young woman emerged carrying document cases similar to those used by the Foundation representatives. Agent Donovan moved to intercept the newcomer, but Eleanor had already recognized her, Dr. Julia Martinez, a rising scholar in Civil War studies whose revisionist work on marginalized perspectives had earned both academic acclaim and political controversy. Eleanor had attended several of her lectures during her librarian career. I invited her, Dr. Harrington admitted, as heads turned questioningly. After seeing the initial documents, I recognized we needed specialized expertise in Civil War correspondence. Authentication. Dr. Martinez has developed new methodologies for identifying authentic period documents versus later reproductions. Senator Shadwell's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes that revealed familiarity and displeasure. Dr. Martinez's methods remain controversial in traditional historical circles, he noted, his tone suggesting deeper objections than mere academic disagreement. Reynolds assessed the situation with practical efficiency. Additional authentication expertise is welcome, provided proper protocols are followed. As Dr. Martinez was integrated into the examination process, Eleanor noticed how the dynamics shifted. The young historian approached the documents with rigorous methodology, but also evident empathy for their human significance. While others focused on jurisdictional questions or historical implications, Martinez examined the materials as connections to individual lives and choices. Major Millfield's moral struggle, the soldiers affected by Shadwell's decisions, the families impacted by prolonged conflict. These journals show evidence of contemporaneous writing rather than later recreation, Martinez observed after detailed examination. The ink composition, paper aging, and handwriting variations all suggest authentic period documentation written over months rather than fabricated after the fact. Her analysis provided crucial validation that strengthened the case for the document's authenticity, making it increasingly difficult for Senator Shadwell to dismiss them as forgeries or misinterpretations. As the examination continued, Eleanor found herself drawn to Martinez's approach, which balanced scientific rigor with recognition of the document's human significance. By late afternoon, the preliminary authentication had established several key points. The materials appeared genuinely. From the period claimed, Major Millfield's position as Shadwell's adjutant was historically documented, and the detailed accounts of troop movements aligned with known battle records, while providing previously undocumented motivations and behind-the-scenes decisions. The revelations painted General Thomas Shadwell not as the tactical genius portrayed. in historical accounts, but as a calculating opportunist who sacrificed ethics and lives for personal glory and family financial interests. If fully authenticated and publicly revealed, these materials would not only revise historical understanding of key Civil War battles, but potentially tarnish the legacy that had elevated the Shadwell family to generations of political prominence. Senator Shadwell's strategy shifted as the authentication process strengthened. Rather than challenging authenticity, he emphasized contextual interpretation. Historical documents require proper contextual understanding, he argued. Military decisions during wartime involved complexities that civilian observers, even adjutants, might not fully comprehend. The Shadwell Foundation can ensure these materials receive appropriate historical framing. The meaning was clear. The family wanted control over how these revelations would be interpreted and presented. Eleanor recognized the senator was offering not just financial compensation to her personally, but institutional funding implications for the museum and foundation representatives. The political leverage at his disposal was considerable, especially for organizations dependent on state budget allocations. As the various authorities continued their jurisdictional negotiations, Eleanor found herself standing slightly apart, watching how institutional power dynamics threatened to overshadow the ethical questions raised by her discovery. The documents revealed not just historical facts, but moral choices. Major Millfield's decision to preserve truth despite pressure, General Shadwell's willingness to sacrifice others for personal gain, and now the modern institutions negotiating how completely that truth would be acknowledged. The turning point came unexpectedly, through technology rather than authority. While the discussions continued in her dining room, Eleanor noticed Dr. Martinez quietly using her phone to document key findings, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. When Senator Shadwell stepped outside to take a call, Martinez approached Eleanor with deliberate casualness. "The truth doesn't belong to institutions," she said quietly, showing Eleanor her screen. "I've been updating a secure academic database with key findings. 30 historians across 5 universities now have the basic documentation, regardless of what happens to the physical materials." The implications were significant. The revelations could no longer be completely suppressed or controlled, regardless of which authority ultimately claimed jurisdiction over the physical documents. The truth about General Shadwell had escaped the confines of Eleanor's barn and the jurisdictional disputes of competing institutions. When Senator Shadwell returned, Eleanor noted a shift in his demeanor, the practiced political charm replaced by more focused calculation. His phone call had apparently conveyed new information that changed his approach. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, addressing Eleanor directly rather than continuing the institutional negotiations, "these materials obviously hold significant historical interest. While questions of jurisdiction and authentication continue, I'd like to discuss your personal interests in this matter." He gestured toward the window, where Eleanor's view of the deteriorating barn was clearly visible. "I understand you're facing county enforcement actions regarding structural concerns. The Shadwell Foundation has considerable experience with historical property preservation. We could ensure this entire property receives proper historical designation, with all financial implications that would entail." The offer was both generous and strategic. Historical designation would prevent the demolition order and provide funding for restoration, solving Eleanor's immediate financial challenges while giving the Shadwell family influence over the narrative that emerged from her discovery. "That's very generous, Senator," Eleanor replied carefully. "However, I believe these documents deserve complete historical evaluation without predetermined constraints." Shadwell's expression remained pleasant, though his eyes hardened slightly. Ms. Mitchell, historical truth is rarely served by sensationalized revelations divorced from proper context. Military leadership during wartime required difficult decisions that can appear controversial when viewed through modern ethical frameworks. The Shadwell Foundation can ensure balanced historical interpretation. The implied threat beneath his reasonable tone was clear. Without the family's involvement, Eleanor might solve her immediate barn problem, but face subtle political obstacles for any future historical preservation efforts. In a state where the Shadwell family maintained significant influence, such opposition could prove challenging. As Eleanor considered her response, she noticed Dr. Martinez and Dr. Harrington exchanging glances, their academic integrity clearly conflicting with institutional pragmatism. Agent Reynolds maintained professional neutrality, though her positioning suggested she was prepared to assert federal authority if necessary. The quiet standoff was interrupted by the arrival of yet another visitor, this one unexpected by everyone present. Through her window, Eleanor watched as a weathered pickup truck pulled into her driveway, and an elderly man emerged with the deliberate movements of someone well into his 80s, but still physically capable. "Who is that?" Agent Donovan asked, moving toward the door with professional caution. Eleanor shook her head, equally puzzled. "I don't recognize him." To everyone's surprise, it was Senator Shadwell who identified the visitor, his composed expression momentarily slipping to reveal genuine shock. "That's Robert Millfield," he said quietly, "the last direct descendant of Major William Millfield." Robert Millfield's arrival created an immediate shift in the farmhouse's atmosphere. The institutional representatives watched with varying expressions as Senator Shadwell moved toward the door, composing his features into a political mask that betrayed nothing of his earlier shock. "Mr. Millfield," Shadwell greeted, extending his hand with practiced cordiality. "This is an unexpected surprise. I wasn't aware you still lived in the county." The elderly man's weathered face remained impassive as he briefly shook the senator's hand. "I keep to myself these days, Senator. Not much for public appearances." His voice carried the distinctive local accent that had faded from younger generations, a living connection to the region's past. Eleanor stepped forward, instinctively offering hospitality despite her confusion. "Mr. Millfield, I'm Eleanor Mitchell. This is my property now, though I understand it belonged to your family originally." Robert Millfield studied her with keen, blue eyes that belied his age. "Ms. Mitchell, heard about you from Hank at the hardware store. Said you were fixing up the old place proper, not just tearing it down like those developers wanted." He glanced around at the assembled officials and experts. "Seems you've found something that's brought the vultures circling." Agent Reynolds stepped forward, professional but respectful. "Mr. Millfield, I'm Agent Reynolds with the Historical Artifacts Division. May I ask how you became aware of today's activities?" The elderly man's laugh held no humor. "Small counties got big ears, Agent. When government vehicles start showing up at the old family property, word gets around." He turned toward Eleanor. "Question is, what exactly did you find that's got everybody from the feds to the Shadwells showing up on your doorstep?" Before Eleanor could respond, Dr. Harrington intervened. "Mr. Millfield, we've discovered documents hidden by your ancestor, Major William Millfield, concerning his service under General Thomas Shadwell during the Civil War. They appear to have been concealed in a purpose-built chamber beneath the barn floor." Robert Millfield's expression revealed nothing, but Eleanor noticed how his gnarled hands tightened slightly on his walking stick. Family stories mentioned something hidden, though nobody knew exactly what or where. "My grandfather said his father told him William had buried the truth where it would eventually be found, but not by those looking for it." This confirmation from Millfield family oral history strengthened the document's authenticity claims considerably. Eleanor observed how Dr. Martinez discreetly continued documenting this testimony while the federal agents exchanged meaningful glances. Senator Shadwell maintained his composure, though Eleanor detected growing calculation behind his political smile. Mr. Millfield, these materials contain potentially sensitive historical accounts that require contextual understanding. The Shadwell Foundation would welcome your family's participation in developing appropriate historical framing. The elderly man's gaze hardened. Contextual understanding, he repeated, the words carrying unmistakable skepticism. The Millfields and Shadwells have different understandings of that history, Senator. Always have. His attention returned to Eleanor. Ms. Mitchell, might I see what you found? These government folks will have their procedures and politics, but I've got a family connection that predates all their regulations. The simple request cut through the institutional complexity that had dominated the day. Eleanor looked to Agent Reynolds, who nodded after brief consideration. Mr. Millfield may examine the materials under supervision as they potentially relate to his family history. As they returned to the dining room where the documents were arranged, Robert Millfield moved with the careful deliberation of age, but without hesitation. His weathered hands, marked by decades of physical labor, contrasted sharply with the specialized gloves the experts wore to handle the fragile materials. "I'll need to wash up first," he said, displaying unexpected awareness of preservation protocols. "Been working with engines all my life. Oil gets into the skin." After carefully cleaning his hands, Millfield was provided with the appropriate gloves. He examined Major William's letter first, his expression softening as he traced his ancestor's handwriting through the protective covering. "My father could write just like this," he said quietly. "Same slant to the letters. Family trait, I suppose." As he methodically reviewed the journals and correspondence, Millfield's reactions provided additional context beyond the documents themselves. He recognized references to local landmarks that had changed names over generations and identified family connections mentioned only by initials in the text. William was the moral one, Millfield explained as he studied a particularly damning account of Shadwell's orders to execute Union prisoners. Family stories always said he struggled with what he'd witnessed during the war. Came back changed, more withdrawn, focused on building the horse farm and kept away from politics, even when the Shadwells tried recruiting him for their campaigns. The historical narrative expanded through this living connection, transforming the formal documents into a family's moral struggle across generations. Robert Millfield's presence added human dimension to what institutional representatives had been treating primarily as historical evidence or political liability. There was a falling out, Millfield continued, indicating a section of the journal describing post-war interactions. The Shadwells wanted William to publicly support Thomas's candidacy for governor, lending military credibility to his campaign. When William refused, the threats began, subtle at first, then more direct. Senator Shadwell shifted uncomfortably, but offered no interruption as Millfield continued his narrative. The elderly man's recollections aligned with and expanded upon the written evidence, creating a compelling through line from past to present. The Millfields lost their prominence while the Shadwells rose, he concluded, surveying the assembled documents with evident emotion. Not because one family was more capable than the other, but because my ancestor couldn't bring himself to publicly endorse what he knew to be lies, while Thomas Shadwell built his reputation on carefully constructed falsehoods. The implications hung heavily in the room. The historical documents weren't merely academic revelations, but evidence of moral choices that had shaped both families' trajectories for generations. The Shadwells ascending to political prominence, while the Millfields retreated into obscurity. Senator Shadwell finally spoke, his tone carefully measured. Mr. Millfield, family histories often contain subjective interpretations passed through generations. Without questioning your sincerity, I must note that personal perspectives can become distorted over time. Robert Millfield met the senator's gaze directly. Some things don't distort, Senator. Right and wrong. Truth and lies. My family chose a harder path because William couldn't pretend a dishonorable man deserved honor. This fundamental moral clarity seemed to momentarily silence the institutional representatives, whose professional lives navigated shades of grey rather than such stark ethical distinctions. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor felt a deepening connection to her property's history, not just as physical space, but as ground that had witnessed principled choices with generational consequences. The contemplative moment was interrupted by a call from Agent Reynolds' superiors, requiring her to step outside for consultation. During this brief respite from federal oversight, Dr. Martinez approached Robert Millfield with focused questions about family records that might provide additional authentication context. My grandfather kept everything, Millfield confirmed. Letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, anything related to the family. After he passed, I stored it all in my workshop. Never had children to pass it to, so it's just been sitting there. Might be something useful in those boxes. This revelation created immediate interest among the historians. Additional Millfield family records could provide crucial corroboration for the hidden documents claims. Dr. Harrington proposed an immediate expedition to examine these materials, while Senator Shadwell suggested the Shadwell Foundation could provide resources for proper preservation of any historically significant items. Before any decision could be finalized, Agent Reynolds returned with new authority. The Bureau's Historical Oversight Division has assumed primary jurisdiction, she announced. Given the national historical significance and potential security implications, these materials will be transported to federal facilities for comprehensive authentication. Senator Shadwell's objection was immediate. Agent Reynolds, these documents relate directly to Virginia history and prominent Virginia families. State historical preservation statutes clearly establish local jurisdiction for such materials. And as the jurisdictional dispute reignited with greater intensity, Eleanor noticed Robert Millfield watching with a mixture of resignation and dark amusement. The institutional battle over historical evidence seemed to confirm some long-held perspective about how power operated regardless of truth. Been this way for generations, he murmured to Eleanor as the officials argued. Shadwells using influence to control the narrative, institutions fighting over who gets to decide what people learn. Meanwhile, the actual truth sits waiting for someone brave enough to simply tell it. His words crystallized something Eleanor had been feeling throughout the day, that beneath the professional protocols and jurisdictional regulations lay a more fundamental question about courage and moral clarity. The documents hadn't just revealed historical facts, but illuminated a pattern of choices that continued into the present. While the authorities continued their debate, Eleanor made a quiet decision. She had initially photographed the documents as a precaution, backing them to her cloud storage. Those images remained accessible regardless of who claimed the physical materials. As if reading her thoughts, Robert Millfield leaned closer. My grandfather used to say that powerful folks can lock away papers, but they can't lock away truth. Once it's been spoken aloud, that's why he made sure each generation heard our family's stories, even when the history books told different tales. This perspective, that truth existed beyond institutional control when preserved through human connection, resonated deeply with Eleanor. Her career as a librarian had been dedicated to information access, to the belief that knowledge belonged to humanity rather than institutions. The jurisdictional battle playing out in her dining room challenged that fundamental principle. The debate took an unexpected turn when Dr. Martinez quietly intervened. While federal jurisdiction may be appropriate for the original documents, historical ethics require consideration of the property owners' and family descendants' perspectives. Her academic authority carried surprising weight as she continued. Standard protocols include creating authenticated copies for relevant stakeholders before transportation to federal facilities. This compromise, preserving federal authority, while acknowledging other legitimate interests, created an opening for resolution. Agent Reynolds consulted with her superiors, while Senator Shadwell calculated whether this approach would serve his family's interests better than continued opposition. During this negotiation phase, Robert Millfield invited Eleanor to join him on the porch, stepping away from the institutional representatives. In the afternoon sunlight, the elderly man's weathered face held a dignity that transcended his modest circumstances. "Ms. Mitchell, may I ask what you plan to do with this property? Beyond saving that old barn, I mean." The question surprised Eleanor, shifting focus from the historical documents to the land itself. "I haven't thought much beyond the immediate renovations," she admitted, "preserving the structures, making the house properly livable. I came here looking for quiet after my divorce, not expecting to become entangled in historical revelations." Millfield nodded, his gaze traveling across the property his family had once owned. "Land remembers things people try to forget. Maybe that's why William chose to hide those papers here rather than destroy them. He trusted the land to keep them safe until the right person came along." This perspective, that the property itself had played a role in preserving truth, offered Eleanor a new framework for understanding her connection to this place. She hadn't randomly purchased land that happened to contain historical secrets. Perhaps something deeper had drawn her here, some instinctive recognition of purpose she hadn't consciously acknowledged. "I believe there's a reason you found those documents, Ms. Mitchell," Millfield continued. "Not just chance or coincidence. William wanted the truth known eventually, but he was wise enough to know his time wasn't ready for it. Perhaps ours is." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Harrington, who joined them with news of a tentative resolution. "The federal team will create authenticated copies of all materials before transport," she explained. "The Shadwell Foundation has agreed to fund a proper historical assessment that includes the Millfield family perspectives. And the National Historical Preservation Foundation has offered to designate this property as a site of historical significance, which would override the county's demolition order for the barn." The practical outcomes addressed Eleanor's immediate concerns about the property while establishing a process for historical truth to emerge through multiple perspectives rather than institutional control. Yet something felt incomplete about this bureaucratic resolution. "And what happens to the truth about General Shadwell?" Eleanor asked. "Will these revelations actually become part of the historical record, or will they disappear into classified archives and carefully worded academic papers?" Harrington's hesitation revealed the limitations of institutional solutions. "Historical revision is a complex process, Eleanor. When established narratives involve prominent families and national myths, change comes gradually through scholarly consensus rather than sudden revelations." Robert Millfield's soft laugh held centuries of perspective. "In other words, the Shadwells will continue shaping how people understand their ancestor, just with some new footnotes acknowledging alternative perspectives. The statues will remain standing, the military academies will still teach his tactical brilliance, and most folks will never know about the prisoners he executed or the men he sacrificed." This assessment cut through professional diplomatic language to the heart of the matter. Institutional processes could document truth without necessarily revealing it to the public consciousness. Eleanor found herself increasingly uncomfortable with this carefully managed approach to historical revelation. As they returned inside, the formal agreements were taking shape. Agent Reynolds coordinated the documentation process, while Senator Shadwell maintained frequent contact with family representatives regarding the evolving situation. The Foundation experts developed preservation protocols for both the physical documents and the historical site designation. Throughout these proceedings, Eleanor observed how institutional momentum gradually transformed a shocking historical revelation into a managed process with prescribed outcomes. The raw truth of Major Millfield's testimony, his moral anguish over witnessed atrocities, his principled refusal to support a dishonorable man's political ambitions, his careful preservation of evidence for future generations, was being systematically incorporated into existing power structures rather than challenging them. The defining moment came when Senator Shadwell approached Eleanor privately as the others focused on documentation procedures. His political smile had returned, suggesting he considered the situation largely resolved in his family's favor. "Ms. Mitchell, I want to personally thank you for your cooperation today. The Shadwell Foundation will ensure your property receives proper historical designation, resolving your concerns about the barn while enhancing the property's value considerably." His tone carried the satisfaction of a negotiator who believed he had successfully navigated a potentially damaging situation. These materials will receive appropriate historical consideration while maintaining proper context regarding wartime military decisions. A balanced approach benefits everyone involved. The implication was clear. Eleanor would receive financial benefits through historical designation, while the Shadwell family would maintain significant influence over how these revelations were interpreted. The institutional machinery would document the truth while carefully managing its public impact. Eleanor considered her response carefully, aware that her decision would affect not just her personal circumstances, but how truth might be preserved for future generations. The comfortable path would be accepting this bureaucratic resolution, securing her property's future, while allowing institutions to determine how completely the historical revelations would be acknowledged. "Senator Shadwell," she finally replied, "I appreciate the Foundation's interest in this property. However, I believe these revelations deserve public understanding, not just institutional documentation. Major Millfield preserved these materials at personal risk because he believed the truth mattered. I have a responsibility to honor that intention." The senator's expression remained pleasant, though his eyes hardened slightly. "Public understanding requires proper historical context, Ms. Mitchell. Unmediated revelations often create sensationalism, rather than genuine historical appreciation. The Foundation's approach ensures scholarly integrity." "Scholarly integrity isn't the same as moral clarity," Eleanor countered, drawing strength from Robert Millfield's earlier perspective. "These documents don't just reveal historical facts, they show a pattern of moral choices with consequences that extend to the present day. That pattern deserves acknowledgement beyond academic footnotes." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion at the front door, the arrival of yet another unexpected visitor. Eleanor recognized the newcomer immediately. Catherine Wells, an investigative journalist whose documentaries on historical cover-ups had earned both professional awards and powerful enemies. "I received some very interesting information about a Civil War discovery," Wells explained as she surveyed the assembled officials with practiced assessment. "Something about hidden documents contradicting the established narrative about General Thomas Shadwell. Given the public interest in historical accuracy, I thought it warranted immediate attention." Senator Shadwell's carefully maintained composure showed its first significant crack. "Ms. Wells, this is a private historical authentication process. Following established protocols, There's no confirmed story here, just preliminary examination of materials that require extensive verification. The journalist's smile suggested she recognized political damage control when she encountered it. Senator, when federal historical teams and the Shadwell Foundation converge on a private property simultaneously, that itself is a story of public interest. When the materials involve potential historical revision concerning a figure with ongoing influence on military education and public monuments, the public interest becomes paramount. Her presence transformed the dynamic fundamentally. The institutional representatives had been negotiating within professional frameworks that valued process and authority. Wells represented a different principle, that public knowledge sometimes legitimately superseded institutional control, particularly when powerful interests sought to manage potentially damaging revelations. Agent Reynolds intervened with professional neutrality. Ms. Wells, these materials remain under federal jurisdiction pending authentication. Any public disclosure would be premature and potentially irresponsible, given the historical significance. I understand authentication protocols, Wells countered, but I also understand when public interest outweighs institutional preferences for controlled disclosure. My sources have already provided substantial information about Major Millfield's documents and their contents. This revelation created immediate concern among the officials. Someone had already shared information beyond the controlled environment they had established, whether Dr. Martinez, through her academic network, Robert Millfield, through local connections, or another source entirely. Senator Shadwell's response was immediate and forceful. Partial information without proper authentication or historical context would constitute irresponsible journalism, Ms. Wells. The Shadwell family would consider any premature publication grounds for legal action. Wells remained unintimidated. The public has legitimate interest in historical truth, Senator, particularly when it involves figures commemorated through public monuments and educational curricula. Documentation of historical distortion serves essential public discourse about how we memorialize our past. As the confrontation escalated, Eleanor recognized a fundamental clash of values: institutional control versus public knowledge, managed narratives versus unfiltered truth, powerful interests versus individual courage. The comfortable resolution that had been taking shape would have preserved the documents while allowing existing power structures to determine how completely their revelations would reach public consciousness. Catherine Wells' arrival had disrupted that managed approach, introducing the possibility that truth might emerge more directly without institutional filtering. The journalist's presence represented the principle that public understanding sometimes legitimately superseded institutional preferences, particularly when those institutions had vested interests in controlling potentially damaging revelations. In this moment of tension, Robert Millfield spoke with the moral clarity that had characterized his family for generations. My ancestor preserved these documents because he believed the truth deserved to be known, even if not in his lifetime. He couldn't bring himself to destroy evidence of dishonorable actions, even when powerful men demanded he do so. That courage deserves honor, not management. His simple statement cut through the institutional complexity to the ethical core of the situation. The documents weren't merely historical evidence, but testimony to moral choices that continued to require courage in the present day, the courage to prioritize truth over comfort, ethical clarity over political expedience. As Eleanor watched the various authorities calculating their responses to this new development, she felt a deepening connection to Major William Millfield across generations. He had faced a similar choice, whether to surrender truth to powerful interests or preserve it despite personal risk. His decision to hide the documents rather than destroy them represented a middle path of moral courage, not immediately confrontational, but ultimately committed to truth's eventual emergence. The property that had initially represented Eleanor's personal retreat from a painful divorce now carried deeper significance. This land had sheltered hidden truth for generations, waiting for someone who would recognize its value and have the courage to ensure its proper acknowledgement. The barn she had fought to preserve against county demolition orders had protected Major Millfield's testimony until its proper moment of discovery. With growing certainty, Eleanor recognized her own responsibility in this historical continuum. She had initially photographed the documents as a precaution, creating digital copies that existed beyond institutional control. Those images could ensure the truth reached public consciousness, regardless of what happened to the physical materials. I believe there's a path forward that respects both institutional protocols and public interest, Eleanor finally stated, drawing everyone's attention. The federal team should complete proper authentication of the physical documents while acknowledging that the historical significance of these revelations extends beyond academic interest to fundamental questions about how we understand and memorialize our past. Her proposal attempted to bridge institutional requirements with ethical imperatives, allowing proper authentication while ensuring the revelations would not be buried through managed disclosure. The various officials exchanged glances, recognizing that while they controlled the physical documents, the knowledge they contained had already begun spreading beyond their ability to contain it. As negotiations resumed with this new understanding, Eleanor stepped onto the porch with Robert Millfield, seeking momentary distance from the institutional complexities. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the property, the weathered barn standing as testament to both deterioration and endurance. "Your ancestor must have wondered if the truth would ever emerge," Eleanor said quietly. "If hiding those documents would ultimately matter." Millfield nodded, his weathered face reflecting generations of family knowledge. William believed in a simple principle, that truth has its own power if given opportunity. He couldn't force his time to acknowledge what happened, but he could ensure future generations would have the choice. This perspective, that preserving truth created possibilities even when immediate justice seemed unattainable, offered profound guidance for Eleanor's own choices. The documents might remain under institutional control, but their revelations had already begun rippling outward through multiple channels, creating possibilities for broader understanding that transcended any single authority's management. "The land remembers," Millfield repeated his earlier observation, gazing across the property his family had once stewarded. "Maybe that's what ultimately matters, not who controls the papers or writes the official accounts, but that the ground itself holds the reality of what happened here. You're part of that continuity now, Miss Mitchell." This connection across time, from Major William's moral choice to preserve evidence through generations of Millfields maintaining family truth despite official narratives, to Eleanor's accidental discovery and subsequent decisions, created a sense of purpose that transcended her initial retreat from personal disappointment. The property she had purchased seeking solitude had instead offered community across time, connection to individuals who had faced similar choices between comfortable acceptance of power's preferences and the harder path of ensuring truth remained accessible to future generations. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the property that had sheltered hidden truth for over a century, Eleanor understood that her discovery had not only revealed historical facts, but illuminated a timeless pattern of moral choices that connected past to present. The institutional representatives might control the physical documents, but the truth they contained had already begun its inevitable emergence. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet courage of individuals who recognized its value and ensured its preservation. 6 months after Eleanor Mitchell's discovery beneath the barn floorboards, Whispering Pines Farm presented a transformed landscape, both physically and symbolically. The October morning air carried the crisp promise of fall as Eleanor stood on the restored farmhouse porch, watching a group of university students follow Dr. Martinez along the newly established historical walking path toward the barn that had become the centerpiece of the Millfield Shadwell Historical Truth Project. The weathered structure that had once faced demolition now stood fully restored, its timbers reinforced and roof replaced using period-appropriate techniques. The renovation had preserved its historical character while transforming the interior into a thoughtfully designed exhibition space where visitors could engage directly with the complex moral questions raised by Major Millfield's hidden testimony. Eleanor sipped from a coffee mug bearing the project's logo, a simple barn silhouette with a document emerging from beneath its foundation, accompanied by the words, "Truth endures." The design had been created by a local high school student during a community competition and now appeared on educational materials, signage, and the modest gift shop items that helped sustain the project's operating costs. "Morning, Eleanor," called Catherine Wells, the investigative journalist whose arrival had proven pivotal during those tense negotiations 6 months earlier. Now a regular presence at the property, Wells was developing a documentary series examining how historical narratives were constructed, challenged, and revised when new evidence emerged. The university group from Richmond just arrived. They've got some interesting questions about how the authentication process worked. Eleanor nodded, watching the students gather around Dr. Martinez near the barn entrance. The journey from private discovery to public historical site had unfolded in ways none of the original participants could have predicted, creating outcomes that transcended the jurisdictional battles that had initially dominated the response. The federal authentication team had indeed taken custody of the physical documents, subjecting them to comprehensive examination at specialized facilities. But rather than disappearing into classified archives, the authenticated materials had become the foundation for a collaborative historical project that brought together federal historians, academic researchers, and the Millfield family's oral traditions. Most surprisingly, elements of the Shadwell family had ultimately joined this effort, though not through Senator Charles. His younger sister, Dr. Elizabeth Shadwell, a respected historian who had long maintained a scholarly distance from family political activities, had stepped forward after reviewing the authenticated documents. "Historical truth serves us better than comfortable mythology," she had stated during the project's launch, her presence lending legitimacy that transcended political damage control. "My family has benefited from a carefully maintained narrative. For generations, we have a responsibility to acknowledge a more complex reality, however uncomfortable." This unexpected alliance between Millfield and Shadwell descendants had transformed what might have remained an institutional conflict into something more profound, a model for how communities could engage honestly with difficult historical truths rather than preserving comfortable narratives that served existing power structures. The barn renovation had been completed through an innovative partnership between the Historical Preservation Foundation, local craftspeople specializing in period construction techniques, and university architectural programs using the project for hands-on restoration training. What had begun as Eleanor's desperate attempt to save a deteriorating structure from demolition had evolved into a community-wide commitment to preserving both physical history and the moral testimony it contained. "They're making real progress on the catalogue," reported Robert Millfield, joining Eleanor on the porch. At 84, he had found unexpected purpose as the project's elder statesman, his lifetime of maintaining family oral traditions providing crucial context for understanding Major William's written testimony. The university team has digitized about 70% of my grandfather's collection. Found some photographs yesterday that show William and Thomas together before the war, boyhood friends before becoming moral opponents. This ongoing discovery process, finding new connections between documented history and family experiences, had become a central element of the project's educational mission. Rather than presenting historical revision as a completed product, the exhibitions emphasized how understanding evolved through continuous engagement with emerging evidence and multiple perspectives. Senator Charles made another statement yesterday, Robert noted with a hint of dark amusement, still maintaining that wartime complexities require contextual understanding while acknowledging that historical perspectives naturally evolve with new evidence. Political language for gradually accepting what he can't control. The Shadwell family's response had indeed followed a trajectory from initial resistance through strategic management to reluctant acknowledgement. Senator Charles had never directly endorsed the project, but had gradually shifted from opposition to careful neutrality as public interest made continued resistance politically costly. The Family Foundation had eventually provided modest funding, carefully framed as supporting comprehensive historical understanding, rather than explicit acknowledgement of General Thomas's documented misconduct. "Morning, Ms. Mitchell." The greeting came from Agent Chen, who had returned for her monthly site visit as part of the ongoing federal involvement in the project. Unlike the initial intervention with its jurisdictional tensions, the Historical Artifacts Division now maintained a collaborative relationship focused on educational outcomes rather than document control. The new interactive display on military ethics is generating significant engagement data. Visitors are spending an average of 12 minutes at that station alone. This professional assessment highlighted how the project had evolved beyond simple historical revelation to engage visitors in deeper questions about moral choices during conflict, institutional accountability, and how societies memorialize complex historical figures. Rather than merely exposing General Shadwell's misconduct, the exhibitions invited reflection on why communities elevated certain narratives while suppressing others, and how individual courage like Major Millfield's could preserve truth even when immediate justice seemed unattainable. Eleanor nodded appreciation for the update as she surveyed the property that had transformed so completely from her initial purchase. When she had fled her collapsed marriage seeking rural solitude, she could never have imagined becoming steward to a historical project that would attract visitors from across the country and generate academic case studies on community-based historical revision. The walking path that wound through the property now featured thoughtfully designed stations exploring different aspects of the Millfield Shadwell narrative. Near the meadow, an installation examined how post-war economic pressures had influenced historical silence, with restored agricultural implements contextualizing how the Millfield family's focus on farming had contributed to their historical obscurity compared to the Shadwells' political ascendance. Beside the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the property, another station explored how military leadership narratives were constructed, using General Shadwell's tactical decisions at Whispering Creek as a case study in how battlefield reality could be reshaped through selective documentation and strategic omissions. Military Academy students now regularly visited this installation, engaging with primary sources that challenged traditional heroic narratives. Most powerfully, the root cellar beneath the barn floor, where the documents had remained hidden for generations, had been preserved exactly as Eleanor had found it, with visitors able to peer into the brick-lined chamber while listening to voice recordings of Major Millfield's most powerful written testimonies. This physical connection to the act of preserving truth, despite pressure, created an emotional impact that transcended academic analysis. "The school buses are arriving," noted Dr. Harrington, who had joined the property's advisory board while maintaining her museum directorship. 50 eighth graders from Millfield County schools today, their first curriculum integration with the primary sources. This educational outreach represented one of the project's most significant achievements. Rather than restricting the historical revelations to academic circles, the program had developed age-appropriate materials, allowing students to engage directly with primary sources and the ethical questions they raised. Young people now explored how historical understanding evolved when new evidence emerged, and how moral courage sometimes required preserving truth for future generations, rather than expecting immediate justice. "I'd never expected any of this," Eleanor admitted, as she and Dr. Harrington walked toward the education center that had been established in a renovated outbuilding. "When I fought to save that barn from demolition, I was just trying to preserve a piece of architectural history. I had no idea what it actually contained." Harrington smiled with the satisfaction of a historian witnessing meaningful engagement with the past. Historical significance often emerges from unexpected places. Eleanor, academic institutions and government archives preserve what power structures consider important, but ordinary places and people frequently hold the truths that didn't fit approved narratives. This perspective, that historical truth sometimes, survived through ordinary people making extraordinary moral choices, had become central to the project's philosophy. Rather than presenting historical revision as the exclusive domain of credentialed experts, the exhibitions emphasized how farm hands, local postmasters, county clerks, and family storytellers had maintained alternative narratives that preserved truth despite official pressures to accept comfortable mythology. As they reached the education center, Eleanor observed the arriving students with their mixture of adolescent energy and genuine curiosity. These young people would engage with history, not as settled facts to be memorized, but as evolving understanding that required critical thinking and moral discernment. They would learn that historical narratives reflected power relationships as much as objective reality, and that individual choices to preserve truth mattered across generations. "Ms. Mitchell." The enthusiastic greeting came from Sophia Jenkins, a local high school senior who had developed such passion for the project that she now led tours for younger students. "We've got something amazing to show you. Remember those letters Dr. Martinez found in the county archive last month? We've been cross-referencing them with Major Millfield's journal entries and discovered they were writing in code about Union prisoners being secretly relocated. It completely confirms his account of the executions." This ongoing detective work, connecting fragments of evidence across multiple sources to reconstruct suppressed truths, had energized local students who discovered that history wasn't remote or fixed, but alive and evolving through their direct engagement. Young people who had previously shown little interest in historical study now spent afternoons voluntarily analyzing primary sources, developing critical thinking skills, while contributing meaningful discoveries to the project. "That's excellent work, Sophia," Eleanor responded, genuinely impressed by the teenagers' historical analysis. "Make sure Dr. Martinez documents your methodology. This could become part of the spring exhibition update." The education center buzzed with activity as the middle school students arrived, dividing into small groups for interactive sessions exploring different aspects of historical investigation. Unlike traditional field trips with passive observation, this program engaged young people as active participants in historical discovery, examining primary sources, comparing conflicting accounts, and considering how personal moral choices shaped historical documentation. Eleanor watched a group gathered around Robert Millfield, his weathered face animated as he shared family stories that paralleled Major William's written testimony. The direct connection between past and present through living memory created an immediacy that transcended textbook history, helping students understand how historical choices continued influencing contemporary reality. The university partnership has been approved for another 3 years, Dr. Martinez reported, joining Eleanor after finishing her tour with the college students. They're expanding the research scope to include other hidden histories throughout the region, cases where official narratives diverged from documented reality, but alternative perspectives were preserved through family records or local archives. This ripple effect, inspiring broader re-evaluation of established historical narratives, had become one of the project's most significant outcomes. What began as a single discovery about one Civil War general had expanded into methodological approaches for identifying and authenticating other suppressed historical accounts, particularly those maintained through non-institutional channels. When official records reflected power interests rather than complete reality. Senator Elizabeth Shadwell called this morning, Martinez continued, referring to the younger Shadwell who had recently won election to the state legislature, running on a platform that included historical transparency and ethical governance. She's introducing legislation to create a historical truth commission that would establish protocols for incorporating authenticated alternative accounts into public education curricula and monument contextualization. This policy dimension represented a transformation few could have predicted during those tense early negotiations. Rather than merely exposing one historical figure's misconduct, the project had catalyzed systemic reconsideration of how historical understanding was constructed, maintained, and revised when new evidence emerged. The process had transcended academic debate to influence how communities engaged with their commemorative landscapes and educational practices. Eleanor excused herself from the conversation as her phone indicated an incoming call from Catherine Wells, who was coordinating with a national educational television program developing a feature on the project. As she walked toward the quieter space of the farmhouse porch, Eleanor marveled at how completely her life had transformed since that April morning when she had reluctantly begun clearing the condemned barn. The property that had initially represented retreat from personal disappointment had become a center for historical engagement that attracted visitors from across the country. The barn she had fought to preserve against county demolition orders now stood as a nationally recognized model for community-based historical reconciliation. Her own role had evolved from solitary restoration to facilitating collaborative re-examination of how societies constructed and maintained historical understanding. Most significantly, the modest farmhouse that had initially offered escape from her collapsed marriage and academic career had become the center of a vibrant community united by commitment to historical truth rather than comfortable narratives. They're implementing the new curriculum module on ethical leadership using the Shadwell-Millfield case study. Future officers will directly engage with how historical mythology can distort understanding of genuine leadership versus self-serving exploitation of military authority. This educational impact represented perhaps the most meaningful outcome of all. Future military leaders would develop ethical frameworks informed by honest assessment of how previous generations had sometimes celebrated moral compromise when packaged as tactical brilliance. The historical revision had transcended academic correction to influence leadership development in ways that might prevent similar ethical failures in future conflicts. As Eleanor and Elizabeth walked the property discussing implementation details, they passed the original site where the hidden chest had been discovered. A simple bronze marker now identified the location, bearing Major William Millfield's own words from his explanatory letter, I entrust these truths to the future when perhaps the full history of our conflict can be acknowledged without threat. My ancestor believed history would eventually accommodate truth, Elizabeth observed, pausing beside the marker. What he couldn't have anticipated was how many people would need to demonstrate courage for that accommodation to occur. From his own descendants maintaining family knowledge, to you fighting to preserve this barn against demolition, to the journalists and academics who insisted on transparent historical processes. This perspective, that historical truth, required not just preservation, but courage across generations, had become central to the project's educational message. The exhibitions emphasized how established narratives rarely yielded to evidence alone, but required individuals willing to prioritize truth over institutional convenience or personal advantage. The most remarkable outcome, Eleanor reflected, is how this property has become a place where people engage with history as an ongoing process rather than settled facts. Visitors arrive expecting to learn about a Civil War general's misconduct, but leave thinking about how historical understanding evolves and why certain narratives persist despite contradicting evidence. This meta-historical awareness, understanding how historical knowledge itself was constructed and maintained, represented a fundamental shift from traditional historical sites that presented authoritative narratives toward a more dynamic engagement with how communities determined which aspects of their past deserved commemoration and how complex moral realities could be honestly acknowledged. As afternoon approached, Eleanor found herself drawn to the quiet corner of the property, where she had established a small memorial garden honoring Major William Millfield's moral courage. Unlike the formal exhibitions with their documented evidence and academic interpretation, this space invited contemplative reflection on the personal costs of maintaining ethical commitment when powerful interests demanded compromise. The garden's centerpiece featured a simple stone bench with an inscription adapted from Major Millfield's journal. Truth possesses its own power when preserved with patience. What cannot be acknowledged today may yet transform tomorrow's understanding if given faithful protection. This philosophy, that preserving truth created possibilities even when immediate justice seemed unattainable, had provided guidance throughout the project's development. Rather than expecting instantaneous revision of established narratives, the team had focused on creating conditions where honest historical engagement could gradually transform understanding through direct encounter with authenticated evidence and thoughtful contextual analysis. As Eleanor settled on the bench, she reflected on how her own understanding had evolved through this unexpected journey. When she purchased the property seeking post-divorce solitude, history had seemed distant and settled, something preserved in books and monuments rather than living beneath barn floorboards waiting for discovery. The chest hidden by Major Millfield had revealed not just historical facts, but a profound truth about how moral choices rippled through generations, creating possibilities that extended far beyond individual lifetimes. "Found you," said Robert Millfield, approaching with the careful gait of his advanced age but unwavering purpose. "The education team is looking for you. Those 8th graders have some questions only the property owner can answer." Eleanor smiled at the term that still felt inadequate for her relationship with this land. She wasn't merely the legal owner of acreage and structures, but a steward of something more profound, a physical space where moral testimony had been preserved until its proper moment of emergence, and where visitors now engaged with questions that transcended historical specificity to address timeless issues of truth, power, and individual responsibility. "Sometimes I wonder what Major William would think of all this," she mused as they walked slowly back toward the education center. When he hid those documents, He couldn't have imagined school groups and military cadets studying his testimony, or descendants of both families working together to acknowledge a more complex truth. Robert's weathered face creased with thoughtful consideration. I think he understood something essential about truth, that it carries its own power when faithfully preserved. He couldn't force his time to acknowledge what happened, but he ensured future generations would have that opportunity. That's a particular kind of courage, the patience to protect truth without witnessing its eventual recognition. This insight, that moral courage sometimes required preserving truth for unknown future recipients rather than expecting immediate vindication, had become central to the project's philosophical framework. The exhibitions emphasized how historical understanding often evolved through accumulated individual choices to maintain alternative narratives when official accounts served power rather than accuracy. As they approached the education center, where enthusiastic students engaged with primary sources and analytical methodologies, Eleanor recognized how completely her understanding of historical significance had transformed. History wasn't something distant or settled, but a living process that required active stewardship, the courage to preserve inconvenient truths, the wisdom to contextualize complex moral realities, and the patience to create conditions where honest engagement could gradually transform understanding. The property that had initially represented personal retreat had become something far more meaningful, a physical space where visitors directly encountered the process of historical revision rather than merely its conclusions. Young people left, understanding that established narratives reflected power relationships as much as objective reality, and that individual choices to preserve truth created possibilities that extended far beyond single lifetimes. As Eleanor joined the students gathered around primary source materials, their faces animated with the excitement of historical detective work, she recognized that Major William Millfield's hidden chest had revealed something more profound than a single general's misconduct. It had illuminated a timeless pattern of how historical understanding evolved, not through institutional processes alone, but through individual courage to preserve inconvenient truths until conditions allowed their proper acknowledgement. The simple woman who had discovered historical documents in an abandoned barn had become part of that continuing pattern, not just revealing facts about a Civil War general, but participating in humanity's ongoing struggle to align historical understanding with moral reality rather than powerful interests. The museum director and FBI agents who had arrived at her property that fateful day had initially focused on institutional protocols and jurisdictional authority, but the project's ultimate significance transcended those frameworks to address fundamental questions about how societies constructed, maintained, and revised their understanding of shared history. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the education center's windows, illuminating young faces engaged with primary documents that had remained hidden for generations, Eleanor Mitchell understood that historical truth possessed a patience that transcended institutional timelines. Major William Millfield had entrusted his testimony to an uncertain future, believing that truth preserved would eventually find its proper moment of recognition. That moment had arrived not through dramatic institutional confrontation, but through the accumulated courage of individuals across generations who recognized that preserving truth created possibilities beyond their own lifetimes. The land that had sheltered hidden testimony for over a century now served a new purpose, not concealing truth, but revealing how historical understanding evolved when individuals demonstrated the courage to preserve inconvenient realities despite powerful pressures to accept comfortable mythology. The weathered barn that had protected Major Millfield's documents now invited visitors to consider their own responsibility in this continuing process. to recognize that historical truth required not just acknowledgement, but active stewardship, to create possibilities for more honest understanding in generations yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.